morning, everybody, and welcome. Our speaker this morning is Kelly Norris from Iowa, where he is the horticulture manager of the Greater Des Moines Botanical Garden, which is a 14-acre garden there. Kelly has undergraduate and master's degrees in horticulture from Iowa State University. He and his family have operated for 10 years Rainbow Iris Farm, which is a nursery they purchased in Texas and moved to home in Iowa. He's the author of a book for Temple Press titled A Guide to Bearded Irises, Cultivating the Rainbow for Beginners and Enthusiasts. And he's currently the editor of Irises, the Bulletin of the American Iris Society. Kelly is part of the new generation of hip gardeners. We all know what that means. And garden writers. He was here in 2009 for the Garden Writers Association meeting, and he gave a talk that caused some controversy titled Gardening with a Y, as in Generation Y. On why an industry largely run by baby boomers failed to attract the millennial market. Maybe he will answer that question during the Q&A after his talk today. He's working on another book for Temple Press called Dig This, Stylish Gardening with Kick-Ass Plants. He's here today to speak about small bearded irises and their companion plant. Please welcome Kelly Norris.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me? All right, very good. I'm sorry that I brought the snow. I mean, this has been following me. I was in New York a couple of weeks ago, and I left, and they got 12 inches 2 days later. And it's a bad trend. I'm going to Fort Collins next weekend, so just watch the weather, and we'll see if this holds. Because if it's 3 in a row, then it's a bad deal. So I'm honored to get to come down here and do this. Actually, the first time I gave this talk, which the slide sort of gives a little different title, and the handout sort of does, but the gist of it is shorter bearded irises or shorter irises and their companions. I gave this for your sister chapter in Denver, so probably a couple of years ago now. And this is kind of one of those sort of passion moments sort of things. So do we need to down the lights a little bit, or can we do that in here? Might be good to give a little contrast.
Ignore the man behind the screen.
How's that? All right, very good. So, total blackout moment. Well, so this talk today is kind of right from the heart of a true plant geek, especially a true iris geek. So among many things, irises are just one of my passions. I'm a plant geek, through and through. But irises were my home base. This is where this all started. They said in the introduction that my family and I purchased this nursery called Rainbow Iris Farm in Texas and moved it to Iowa. And the gist of that story is when I was 15. At the end of July in about 2002, I sat down with my parents at the dinner table one night and said, I think we should buy an iris nursery. And this followed on a conversation. This is the part of the story that nobody knows. This follows on a conversation where about 5 years earlier, about 3 years earlier, I was 12, I said we should buy a lilac nursery. And that didn't work out. So the iris nursery thing comes up, and my dad, who, and in a what he thought at the time was a very wise parenting move, said, well, sure, give him a call and, see what happens. Thinking that, a 15-year-old would call these people who were selling their nursery and laugh this kid away. And I don't think they were the ones laughing after the phone call. So, or maybe they were, I don't know. So the rest, they say, is history. We flew to Texas, made the arrangements, and moved 40,000 irises from north of Austin, Texas, to our farm in southwest Iowa. And thus began Rainbow Iris Farm, which now... will be our last year actually doing full retail mail order. We have 7.5 acres of irises, and it's 2 hours away from where I live and where I work. So the logistics of trying to keep that up are getting to be a little challenging. So it's going to kind of go back to the hobby business that it was once envisioned to be, instead of the full-time thing that it became. Now that I'm in this sort of new chapter in my life, managing a botanical garden. So among my other plant interests, irises have always kind of been there, and particularly the little irises. I'm staying with Bob and Rosemary Prees, and Bob and I's introduction came, I think, almost 10 years ago when, out of the blue again, I got the idea that I would take up the editorship of the Dwarf Iris Society newsletter, which was looking for an editor at the time, because I'd gotten really smitten with these little tiny irises, these little tiny bearded irises that flower at 5 or 6 inches tall. And I was just completely in love with them, and so I wanted to learn more, and I wanted to connect with people who also loved them, and so thus began, I guess, my editorial career with irises and little irises, and to some degree even rock gardening is how that sort of started. I built my first rock garden not long after that, and have been kind of a geek in that regards ever since. And so when I come out and do talks like this, I always have to put in a chime for what I call my 3P concept about horticulture, and it's just a brief sidebar if you'll let me do it, is that I tell people that horticulture is a 3P concept. It's about people, plants, and passion, and in that order. It's first and foremost about people. It's why we get together in rooms on cold, snowy days and talk about plants. It's because we're here as much to talk about plants as we are just to enjoy each other's company and the fellowship of being in like horticultural minds. Obviously today we're talking very much about a specific group of plants and their specific needs and interests and that sort of thing. But it's passion that ties all of these things together. And this is one of those philosophies that I really have tried to spread in the course of the industry. I started back in Raleigh in 2009 giving that talk, which has changed in many ways about how horticulture as a business and as an industry can be more effective in bringing more people into a greater awareness about the importance of horticulture in our daily lives. So today we're kind of going to break up the talk into about 4 chapters. We're going to talk about sort of one of the most recent rock garden that I built, just as a sort of a context for how some of these little irises come to call my garden home and some of the experiences I've had with them. We're going to go through a parade of various little irises, mostly bearded irises. When we only have an hour together, we were yesterday talking about which irises I was going to talk about, and I finally was like, I've only got an hour. I mean, we need to focus on one little section if we can. So we're going to mainly talk about little bearded irises, their companions, and then kind of look ahead, what I call over the rainbow, at some of the breeding work and some of the seedlings that we've got coming along, or that we have in this case recently introduced too. Anybody want to take a stab? This is one of those like quiz moments as to what that is. That you all know, surely. This plant in the photo?
Bird of paradise?
Well, that's actually an astute observation, because there is a connection to bird of paradise. Certainly, that you have that visual connection to Strelitzia. This is Cysrhynchium palmifolium. Does anybody grow it? Tony's raising his hand. I thought you did. Fun little. I actually didn't put the Cysrhynchium irid module in this talk for today, but there are just so many of these wonderful irids that kind of they don't get talked about. The Iris Society sort of goes, well, those aren't irises, and they don't talk about them. When I was editor, and I should say that my bio needs to be updated from what Bobby had, is that I just recently left that position as editor-in-chief of Irises, and in the 5 years I spent editing the magazine, I always used to kind of throw in these little nods to irids, and people would write and go, but those aren't irises, why do you talk about those in the Iris magazine? And I did it anyway, and so, they either liked it or they didn't. The thing I love about rock gardening is that, there's gardening with rocks, and then there is rock gardening. And on my last trip to the Black Hills, my dad runs a construction business, which you'll learn in a very few number of slides. And so when we build rock gardens, it's kind of like a go big or go home strategy. And so when I was in the Black Hills a couple of years ago on a plant collecting expedition, I emailed him this photo, and I said, what would it take to move that? And he suggested it was perhaps beyond our resources. But closer to home, this is one of the most recent rock gardens. The outhouse is only there during season when the nursery is running, so that I didn't realize when I built this the first time, and everybody started laughing in Denver when I showed this, because I'm just so used to seeing it there, I didn't even think about it. So that's not a permanent addition to the landscape. But this is one of the more recent scree gardens that I've built at home that we're going to kind of just look through, because the construction of it was kind of fun. There's the sort of the before picture and the elevation stakes and that sort of thing. That's the cornerstone. That's my dad, and then the exit. We have a very long driveway at the farm. We found this on a farm about 10 miles west of where we're at. My dad was building some terraces and was moving some dirt and felt a thud, and this was said thud. So here we are. You all do this, right? I mean, this is what rock gardeners do, right? So there's the cornerstone in place. My mother was very nervous about this project for, I think, a number of reasons. It's actually the exact same square footage as the first rock garden, which you really can't see. It's kind of more over here in front of the house. That one is about 80 feet long and about 7 feet wide at its widest point. And this is the same square footage, just kind of in a different shape and arrangement. too. But I was out of space for little irises in that front one, so we had to build another one here. This is bringing in some of the other pieces too. One of our neighbors so our farm is, if you looked at a map, I live in Des Moines, which is the capital city, and it's sort of right in the center of the state. Our farm is in southwest Iowa, so it's like a mile above the Iowa-Missouri border, about 3 counties in from the very corner. So we're what they call Laplanders, because the definitions of the states get a little blurred, although we very clearly consider ourselves Iowans because Missouri's across the border. So, but across the border, there's some friends of ours who own property that has an old quarry on it, which is a convenient friend to have if you're into rock gardening and have means to move necessarily large pieces. So there's after all of the log chain included, things got kind of put together and placed, and some of the initial rounds of planting, and kind of what it looked like the very first summer afterwards too. And then I've got those 2 springs later, not quite before cleanup, but.
What was your top dressing a couple of slides back?
Hold on, let me find it here. Where are you looking at here?
One before that. What did you put down? Is that what sort of organic matter?
Oh, that's just our soil.
That's
He was asking me what kind of top dressing that was, and I'm thinking, there's gravel there? I mean, that's just our soil. Patty, when I showed this in Denver, Panayotis Kalaitis was the first to say afterwards, he goes, he said, people will envy the fact that you can build a rock garden on top of that chocolate cake that you do for soil. So it actually is a bit of a challenge sometimes. We have the problem, our soil is a little too rich in some cases, so we have to make it worse to be able to build rock gardens sometimes. So I add there's a lot of grit and a lot of gravel that's in that top layer too. And the thing that's sort of misleading about the color of the soil is that there is still a vein of clay that kind of runs through there, which for my sake is fun. I love clay soil to some degree. I like being able to sort of challenge plants, and if you spend a lot of time geeking around in the wild, you start to gain appreciation for the context in which a lot of plants struggle in some cases to thrive, and yet are still able to do it. And maybe that just comes from being, having a geeky interest in physiology and wanting to kind of stress plants out and see what they still do. But so I don't mind that at all too. This is one of the shots of some of the front rock garden and some inspirations. I spent a lot of time in the Ozarks and the Ouachita Mountains and plant collecting there and really studying the flora of the Ozarks and again, an environment that isn't necessarily the most hospitable looking for plants at first glance, but has a really fascinating flora, all things considered too. That's my little cousin getting his first dose of. Was having an Easter egg hunt in my species tulips. So, but anyway, on to little irises. So, my introduction to little irises came basically in the miniature dwarf bearded class, and I think I'm going to show you here kind of what the architecture is like. If you have my book or if you know anything about bearded irises, there are 6 classifications of bearded irises, from the little tiniest of them at miniature dwarf in height to the tall beardeds, which I cut off because they're too tall for our talk today. So, and we're really only going to be talking about sort of this realm here on the shorter end of the scale. Ironically enough, each of these classes, while horticulturally defined, kind of have this sort of this sequence, not only in height but in bloom season. The miniature dwarfs are, of course, the earliest of the beardeds to bloom. These bloom, if we had to stack up all irises here, these would be kind of third in position behind the reticulatas and the junos. So reticulatas would be, or the junos, depending on which species you had, might compete for first or second, and then the miniature dwarfs kind of come in third in position in perhaps the grand scheme of irises. So the miniature dwarfs are an interesting group of plants. I'll throw out a number just to kind of give us some sense of where we're going. There are 60,000 names registered and affiliated with the genus Iris. So 60,000 cultivars that have been registered at some point or kept track of by the American Iris Society. Never complain again about the number of heucheras or echinaceas coming onto the market, because at a rate of maybe 50 or 60 of those a year, you've got a long ways to go to catch up with 60,000 names for irises. It's really ridiculous. A lot of those names may never have been all that extant. A lot of them are varieties that might have been developed and shared between neighbors. I mean, the number is kind of a balloon, and there's a lot of hot air in it, certainly. But of the, breaking things down a little bit, those 60,000 varieties, that's all irises. That's everything. Bob, what of that number is bearded irises? Like 25,000-ish?
About 30,000.
Okay, so 30,000 of those are bearded irises. Of those 30,000 names associated with bearded irises, I would say over 85, if not 90% of those are derived primarily from 12 species of bearded irises. And from that, of those 12 species, predominantly from about 4 or 5. And so it's really interesting to see this sort of expansion of genetics from a relatively small slice of a very plastic genome in the world of irises. And so at the small end, you have a couple of species, Iris pumila and Iris attica. Iris attica is shown here. This is a really, really unusual cherry-colored form. Most of the time, these are kind of just purpley and whatever. This is a cherry form that I have from seed. But Iris pumila, this is a slide I scanned from the Dwarf Iris Library back in the day when I was editor, and I think shows it probably in the best native context as any photo that I probably have of it. Flowering at 2.5, maybe 3 inches tall in this steppe in Austria. Really, really short grass. And yet this is sort of this one species predominantly alone has given rise to the, maybe 800 varieties of miniature dwarfs that there are, and then however many thousands of varieties of standard dwarf bearded irises that are beyond that too. So, when Linnaeus was assigning names to plants, the fact that he gave Iris to the group of plants that he did was pretty smart. Iris was a messenger of the gods in Greek mythology, and when she traveled from Earth to Mount Olympus, she left a rainbow in her path. So the fact that this association with all of this variation of colors and types in the wild came to sort of be recognized in name of the genus, I think was kind of obvious. There are other forms of Iris pumila. There are purple forms, there are brownish forms, there are yellowish forms. The variation is there's actually some turquoise forms too, which I'll show you at the very end that are quite nice. Sort of the interest in dwarf irises in this country really goes back to the Indianapolis area of all places. Walter Welch was by all accounts the founder of the Dwarf Iris Society, and really for many 1950 through the 1970s, the primary interest in miniature dwarf irises in this country was in the Indianapolis area. And so he was really instrumental in making crosses and really trying to open up the breeding realm, because at the time, these sorts of little irises were kind of almost looked down upon in the iris world. I mean, the Iris Society had started with a very kind of East Coast contingent of horticulturists and landscape architects who loved tall bearded irises and peonies and lilacs and this whole array of interesting groups of plants that, and many of the same people were involved in founding those societies. But these shorter irises were not really thought all that much of. And let's see, in Sidney Mitchell, in his book Irises for Every Garden, I think it was the early 1940s, in one of his chapters writes very optimistically that I really think people are coming around to small irises. and this was decades before anybody probably really seriously thought about the potential of small irises in the garden. So it took people like Walter Welch and his cohorts to really open this up. Look at all of those seedlings, though. I mean, isn't that fantastic, these little sorts of things? I think it's interesting that big people like me are really fascinated by little things down the ground. My dad's 6'4" and just doesn't get it. He doesn't, it's like I'm 6'1", he's 6'4", and there's a difference between those 3 inches in our appreciation for things that small. And, there's a whole other world when you can lay on your stomach and look through those things. They're just amazing like that. So there's just a series of kind of color groups here I wanted to kind of highlight in the course of how I organize some of these varieties to talk about. One of the things that you'll see a lot if you read about miniature dwarf bearded irises is the spot pattern. Below, if you noticed, and I think that slide, the little purple one in the Austrian steppe, you could kind of see that in the fall, which is the petal, of course, that hangs down, that there's kind of this darker sort of smudge in the middle. And there's this genetic recessive that if you're able to sort of pull that out, you get left with these really, really intense patterns of spots of color rounded by clearer colors like white or cream. You can even see it in reds like African wine there at the top, where there's an intensification of pigments in the center of the fall like that really glows. This pattern is really one of, I think, the major things from a breeding standpoint that miniature dwarf bearded irises are known for. And it's a pattern that for decades breeders have tried to migrate from these shorter tones up into larger flowers so we can sort of see that really dominant contrast. And they've been successful, probably just only in the last 5 years or so, and finally moving that spot pattern into tall bearded irises that are saturated with all this kinds of color. I think a point that I want to make here, particularly in reference to a photo like Self-Evident here, if you could see that entire photo, it's a clump that's, I don't know, maybe 14, 15 inches across. It's a 2-year clump. these things have tremendous vigor. The miniature dwarfs are just, you think when you go out in the wild sometimes you see plants and you see, Monarda bradburyana is one example of this plant that I think about this. If you saw Monarda bradburyana in the wild in the Ozarks, you would never think that it would be a clump forming, really lush, kind of densely flowered Monarda when you bring it into the garden. Because in the wild, it's growing under stress and competition. It's growing on single stems. It's very, almost insipid looking. And just as that photo, that little iris pumila might suggest in that steppe in Austria, in the wild, in an ecological context where there's competition in those plants, they're going to perform a lot differently than when they're in a nice, well-cared-for rock garden with a nice little, chicken grit ring around them. And these things fill out in the garden to be these almost bouquets of flowers that just kind of erupt from the ground. And the thing about miniature dwarfs is that, in a big tall-bearded iris, there's branches and lots of buds and things. We're only talking about 6 inches of space. There's just not a lot of space here in which evolution can maximize the number of flowers. So it really is, we're only talking about 1-2 flowers per stalk. But the plant sort of in its successive generations, growing and sort of expanding, makes up for that by just putting up lots and lots of stalks. Sometimes you'll see multiple stalks coming from the same rhizome, which is sort of an abnormal thing when you think about in taller bearded irises, just because everything's so much bigger. But you'll see sometimes 2, 3, 4 flower stalks coming out of some of these pumila-derived cultivars. So you really get an incredible sort of show for each cultivar. And then once you do that and you love that, you just have to keep getting more of them so you can just get the varieties kind of staged out and get more of that effect happening over and over and over. This is another example of just a 2-year-old clump in one of my gardens at home that, again, is maybe 12 inches across and is just full of all these little divisions. And just, permitted space to kind of keep growing and to kind of keep expanding into these, kind of open areas. They'll go on like that for several seasons without needing divided. Some varieties need divided a little sooner than others, some don't. This is sort of an array of kind of the spot pattern and more kind of carotenoid pigments. One of our most popular ones is flashy neon up here at the top. I had to take it off the website eventually because I wanted to save some for myself because people would just ravage my garden if they could see where it's growing. It's really impressive once you get all these colors and that many flowers. And I think as highlighted here, one of the things that really fascinates iris geeks, at least me, about these sorts of things is that you've got standards, falls, and beards. You've got these sort of 3 components from a breeding standpoint that you can kind of tweak and mess around with and create these different effects. I always say I'm going to take Photoshop through and go and change the colors of beards or remove the beards because it would completely change your reaction to some varieties. The beard is really what does it in some cases. I think this flower would be altogether boring without that white beard to really set things off too. One of the tiniest miniature dwarfs that's registered, it's like at 2.5 inches tall. I have to be careful not to, to step on it. It's growing into my path actually, as some of these larger rocks that kind of separates part of the garden, and it just sort of creeps along and you end up with these just incredibly tiny little flowers. It'd be ideal at a trough where it wouldn't have any risk of getting sort of clobbered by big gardeners along the way. Now, a lot of these patterns and a lot of these variations sort of stay with the standard dwarfs because really the standard dwarf bearded class, which is kind of the next class up in that scheme, is a horticultural class. It's derived primarily from crosses of miniature dwarfs and tall beardeds and with selection for stems that were still just slightly taller with flowers that were slightly bigger but that were still in the earlier flowering ends of the spectrum. So this has a great story between a man by the name of Paul Cook, who was in Indiana, and his cohort, Geddes Douglas, who was in Nashville. Of course, their bloom season is separated by about 2 or 3 weeks, and so they would mail pollen back and forth to each other, and to match sort of with the crosses that they were making, so that they would, be able to get these 2 very disparate groups of plants, these little dwarfs that bloom maybe a full month in some cases, ahead of these tall beardeds. And so they would pass pollen back and forth to facilitate these crosses. And so it's this really great kind of horticultural story about creating a whole new group of plants, kind of, it's like love letters by mail, except it was pollen. That's the true way to steal a plant geek's heart, is to send them, or a plant breeder's heart, is to send them pollen. Now jumping ahead into into kind of the present state, these standard dwarf beardeds have just evolved to be a class with endless possibilities. There's just no end to the number of flowers and the patterns and variations. There's this whole Eye series from our friend Paul Black out in Salem, Oregon. This is Eye of Sauron. I think there's Eye of the Tiger too, which I think might be coming out. Giggles and grins. You start to see these kind of technicolor patterns. The genetics of irises. are not well understood. There's a lot of hypothetical sorts of conclusions about how the genetics of some of these things works, but there's no research dollars for this kind of stuff. We're all, this is a horticultural crop with no money to support formal research. So a lot of these things are, are guesses at best, but the layering of these pigments over the top of each other suggests a couple of different things. These are all tetraploids nowadays. These standard dwarfs, we have tetraploid tall-beardeds and tetraploid dwarfs, and so these have given rise to this kind of race of amazing little irises here. And so you get these layering of patterns, codominance of different color groups and layers of pigments, and you get just a whole array of things. I mean, the whole color, the whole rainbow, the whole spectrum is represented. Greens, olive colors like this with blue beards, to bright oranges too. These bright sort of carrot and colors just were for so long a dream of many iris breeders to bring these into the fold, and we've been really successful in that, I think, in the last 20 years, in really intensifying the colors that you see here. Varieties like Jive and Pele, another sort of selection of amber colored varieties. There's Eye of the Tiger, which is one of our consistent top sellers every year, and then Absolute Joy and Amber Ice too. This looks like a little gelato that you could just eat, and the color is really that rich and that fantastic. You get some really interesting neon effects. Varieties like Rosalie Loving come along. The culture on these is really very similar again to the miniature dwarfs. They're perfect in rock gardens. The setting, these are maybe averaging 12 inches tall at best, and they're forming really dense clumps. A lot of people like the standard dwarfs a little bit better than the miniature dwarfs because they're not quite so short. Not that that's a problem for rock gardeners necessarily, but they're a little bit taller, they're a little bit fuller, and you get a lot more effect because you just get a lot more real estate and you get a lot more scale in which to appreciate those. So, bud count on these is really important when we're judging these things as in the Iris Society. We're starting to look more and more for additional buds on these stocks. Traditionally, 2, maybe 3 buds. That paradigm is shifting to 3, 4, sometimes even 5 buds on these little standard dwarfs on some of the varieties coming out of the West Coast, and getting more branches and more buds. Because the biggest complaint against bearded irises is people start to roll their eyes when I go on and on about these things, and they're like, yeah, but Kelly, they only last for so long. And I think that's fine. I mean, I've never understood to some degree why everything has to flower all the time. There are 250,000 species of flowering plants on this planet, and we use approximately 5 to 6% for all of horticulture and all of our agronomic needs. There is a huge amount of diversity that is not being utilized on this planet for various respective purposes for either aesthetics or sustenance. Who cares if something blooms for only 3 weeks at a time? Find something else to fill the void. I mean, it's a call to a greater plantsmanship and more diversity in the landscape. And so I like the fact that these are bloom for moments in time. I want to spread the moment out as long as I can, but I don't want it to last forever. As a kid, I thought the notion of Christmas every day was just great. But I like a little space between things. So after I've seen something like Spanish rainbows, which on a 2-year clump will bloom for 3 weeks. I mean, it's just solid. The blooms just go on and on. I'm ready for something else. I'm ready for the attention to sort of shift and move on. Again, a really classic sort of spot pattern coming through in a Colorado-bred variety. Really cold-hardy rubies. Gold. Pinks are out there too. This is a rebloomer. This is a Virginia bred and introduced cultivar, so you would probably get really good, reliable rebloom. We tend to, in most years, if it's a really dry drought year, we don't get rebloom. Just to sort of comment on reblooming irises, I think in 1980, Ben Hager, who was one of the gods of 20th century iris breeding, said, in 30 years, I don't know why anybody would want to grow anything but reblooming irises, and which is... makes sense, but unfortunately reblooming iris breeding hasn't really progressed in the same way as reblooming or remontant things like Hemerocallis or other perennial groups has. The daylilies got really lucky, I think, with things like Stellodora and Happy Returns, and even though we sort of poo-poo all those plants, as a plant breeder, our secret darkest desire is to have a plant that is so successful that McDonald's plants it by the thousands, really, because the royalties that come from that are huge. But so I mean, those plants, because of their remontant characteristics, were very successful. In irises, we just haven't seen that. It's a little more complicated, and so it seems that there are very distinct groups of rebloomers. There are those that repeat themselves, so they flower kind of in quick succession right after their first spring flush. There are those that rebloom sort of at the middle of the summer, which in really hot, humid places like North Carolina or hot, humid, windy places like the mid-continent of the US is a bad idea because those flowers last for about 15 minutes when they come out. I have a couple of varieties that rebloom like clockwork within 2 or 3 days of the 4th of July. And they literally last for 15 minutes. I mean, it's just, they're kind of out and they're gone. But then there are those rebloomers that bloom late in the fall or into the fall, modeling really a lot of their biological behavior of what spring is like. You know, shorter days, cooler nights, that kind of thing. And in your part of the world where you can get longer falls and things, those kinds of rebloomers make a lot of sense, and they have a lot of value in the garden. Sweethearts again falls into that category of rebloomers that do come in sort of into the fall season again too. It works really well for us when we have a fall and it lasts for more than 2 or 3 weeks. I was telling somebody in the beginning, we plunged into winter about mid-November this year and have since remained. So which is in high contrast to most of the last 10 years when we've had very long kind of distended falls, and I've had reblooming irises on the Thanksgiving table many, many times in the last 10 years. Because they've just still been going without any problems. So another thing to mention too is that they are frost tolerant. A lot of those varieties, once they've formed, will hold up fairly well through a couple of frosts and things too. Really pushing the definitions of colors too, really having as many colors in the dwarf varieties now that we have in the taller varieties. There's these really incredible black veins below this too, and we've got crosses to try and pull out those black veins to get sort of a white ground with black veins running through it on these little flowers. And I think we'll probably get there to some degree in just a few generations. There's browns. I love brown flowers. I love black flowers. I love all those sort of, dirty, fun colors that people aren't supposed to like. Silver leaves, all that the metallic sorts of stuff that people go, ooh, and I love them. Some people have very distinct opinions about them. That's fine. I love chocolate, and so here we are. Death by chocolate actually smells like chocolate, and I don't know if that's a psychological thing or not, and I have a poor sense of smell, so I tend to think that if I can smell it, it must be true. So there's the brown ranges of things, some really excellent saturated colors. The thing about those, though, it's kind of like, does anybody use Leptonella as a ground cover at all? I don't know how well that does in this part of the world. It's, the black, clicking too fast, the black variety is fantastic, but it looks like the ground. Like you have to have something contrasting against it, which is the thing about these is that, they're like 12 or 14 inches above the ground, but you need something kind of high contrast below them, otherwise they just sort of blend in and look like soil. So another rebloomer too that reblooms really well across, in my experience, a wide range of the country, aptly named what again? And a Lincoln, Nebraska bred variety. It's been really instrumental in breeding a lot of other rebloomers in kind of this same sort of strange color combination of kind of olive, muddy, mustard thing, and then blue together. And then flirting again as an antecedent out of that. Same kind of effect and color pattern too. If you've ever spent any time in the Sawtooth Mountains, this variety is aptly named. And this is showing, actually, this is introducing another kind of pattern that we haven't talked about yet called the placata pattern, which in the iris world is a very, very popular pattern, almost to ill effect. It's the pattern that everybody loves. It's some kind of ground color, like here, where we have yellow, that's sort of dotted and stitched with another color around it. If you've ever seen, like an iris like Jesse's Song or Stepping Out, that it's a white ground with purple stitching around it, I mean, people just get, really weepy about that kind of color pattern. And it's not ultimately that creative. It's purple and white, and it's been done a million times. And so these variations thereof in the littler classes are really exciting because they sort of change things up. We add yellow or cream to the ground. We overlay it with kind of these ruby or metallic colors. Sometimes it's a really faint kind of wash of blue, as in the case of It Ain't Me, Babe. When you have 60,000 names, you have to start getting really creative about which names that you register. So you have to forgive some of these people a little bit because there's just not that many options sometimes. Vavoom, aptly named. There's nothing false about the color on the screen. It's just really that alarming. It's a great traffic barrier along the front of the Hell Strip. People would certainly notice that too. I want to touch on a couple of other species that don't really have much of a heritage in developing than usual novel varieties, but themselves are quite novel and interesting and to some degree have merits, or at least a botanical interest for geeks like us who want to have cool things. There is an iris called Purpurea bractea, which is a little bit taller than some of the things we've been talking about, maybe between 12 and 18 inches tall, depending on which provenance you're looking at, but has these really phenomenal purple-colored bracts and white or yellow flowers. It's a trait that I think two of us are probably working at, and me less so than the other person, who's really trying to get purple foliage in irises, and purple stalks and purple spathes, and is having some success actually. Has got some really interesting seedlings. If you've grown a number of bearded irises, you'll know that there are varieties that at the base of the fan have these really nice, strong flushes of purple color, and it's very creatively called purple-based foliage in the iris realm. So if you see a variety sold and you see the things PBF, that's what that means. And so trying to expand that color from more or less just the bases up through the entire blade of the plant. And Tom's having some luck, and we'll see if what he turns out with too. But then trying to get the stalks and the spathes to be that color too. Then you'd have something to sort of counter the argument that once irises are done, there's nothing but really spiky green foliage to look at. You'd have purple spiky foliage to look at, which would be fine. And would look better than agaves do about this time of year after this kind of weather, I think. So, a whole other little tribe of little irises here, Iris venturica and Iris flavissima. These things are neon in color. There's some argument as to whether all these are distinct species or whether they're just this widely distributed species from pretty much the whole extent of sort of northern China in through interior parts of Asia and even as far west as Asia Minor. But they have really grassy-like foliage and flower just profusely. I don't think I have the clump shot in here from the garden, but they're weedy almost. I mean, they're super vigorous. You get 1 or 2 buds per stalk, but they can go through a couple of flushes of flowers in the same spring, so you'll get these kinds of these really neon colors lasting for quite a while in the same period of time. Now, do you grow a lot of Juno irises down here? Is there a lot of interest in Junos? The flies are going around here. I'm hearing
I don't know if they do.
Okay, I don't. The Junos are an interesting group of plants, and they're really the only true bulbous irises that are actually in the mix of things. Several species, probably the only one I've included is the most widely distributed, I think, and probably the toughest of them is the cornleaf iris, which I think in the corn state in Iowa should be more common than it is, because it does have foliage that has that sort of grassy kind of stalked appearance. This mass is obviously Denver Botanic Garden, and these are a few of them dotting the Front Rock Garden at home. I know that Brent and Becky Heath have large plantings of them at their gardens in Virginia, and so I don't know. The Junos, I think, are a group of plants that are kind of just not very well understood in modern day horticulture as to how widely they could be grown. Obviously, the mountain states have a number of species available to them. At Panaeota calatus, in one of my last issues of irises, do a sort of a survey of them for people, because I think even in the iris world, people are like, Juno what? Like, there's just not an awareness of what they are. So, a group of plants I think that we have a lot to learn from. But Bucarica, by far, is the only one, if I encounter them at all, that I see anywhere kind of around the country like that. So now I sort of want to take a little parade through some of the companion layers of things. When I was writing the book for Timber, one of the questions that kept coming up, or one of the desires that Timber had, was really to talk about companion plants and irises. Rosemary and Bob and I were talking on the drive here as to how kind of linear the iris world's thinking is about things. You go to iris conventions and you don't see irises in gardens. Like when you go to a rock garden convention, you see nice troughs, you see lots of plants in one setting. At iris conventions, it's rows of irises with labels in beds by themselves. It's a very sort of segregationist kind of attitude. And so I talked a lot about in the book, about how irises can be celebrated with so many other plants. There's a couple of things to keep in mind when you're thinking about pairing these with other things. And the rock garden is really the best context, I think, to show off the beauty of some of these varieties. Many of them, if not all of the miniature dwarfs and even some of the standard dwarfs, do not like overhead competition. So you can have like little sedums and things occasionally running through them. But if there's something that gets a little bit taller and kind of wants to shade them out, they can get a little bit fussy, and they can, in the sense that they just don't bloom nearly as well. For years, I think I've got a really great shot of it. Yeah, this is great. This is one of those overzealous, youthful mistakes that you make in the garden when you're 14 and don't know anything. I had a collection of fairly historic varieties, and I didn't really know it at the time, but I had bought several varieties, and they happened to be quite heirloom in their nature, and so I had put them at various places at the edges of my shade garden, which there's some reasonable thinking there. When these things are blooming, there's no shade out yet. The trees haven't leafed out yet, so it is a full sunny exposure. But the part that I didn't get about that was overhead competition, or things that might run them over. So this was, I think, 2 or 3 years after I'd planted this little variety called Buttercup Charm. And I had planted it, and then in a couple of years, the laliums that were reseeding all over hell in the garden had come to call company with the Buttercup Charm, and it was just not a great idea, and I eventually lost that because that variety just got completely choked out. It's kind of the ultimate worst end of the spectrum there for the example, but just something to be cautious of is that you have to think about, again, how these plants grow in their native context. In the wild, they're in steppes, they're in very low, grassy situations, and so sometimes often even in exposed places. So they like to have a little space around them. It looks better, too, to some degree. So in the garden, at home, there's a whole endless array of things that we grow in concert with these smaller irises, one of which is the pulsatillas, of course. You occasionally have to weed out seedlings of the pulsatilla because they start spreading everywhere. But if you can keep sort of the rings around them, the combinations at the time in which they flower are really, really charming. I tend to think that one of the best first moments in my garden, or maybe the best moment the whole year in our garden in Iowa is around the 1st of April, is when these things start coming out. I love the garden on the 1st of April. Most gardens are still like muddy with pansies. And I've got this whole sort of bouquet of things happening, from the dwarf irises to all of these companions at the same moment. One of the combinations that you saw with the cornleaf iris a few slides before really was kind of just right next to this too, with some of the creeping veronicas, the rock cresses, and then the varying sedums as well too. These things are low enough growing that they're really not going to shade over any of the rhizomes or sort of compete against some of those clumps of little irises, so kind of a little great trifecta that works at least in the garden at home too. Now, is anybody good? This is a newer variety of prostrate veronica. Has anybody grown it yet? It's called Tidal Pool. Tony, how's it done for you? Oh, it's big thumbs down. Okay. Well, you don't know until you ask, right? So this is a variety from Chicago Botanic Garden, from Jim Alt's breeding work of creeping veronicas. It does really, really well growing very well in the Northeast and in the Midwest. It just has been out for a couple of years, and so I was interested to see what some early appraisals of it were. In Chicago, it's growing there in pure clay in that test garden. If you've never been to sort of the back of house at the Chicago Botanic Garden, their soils where their trial gardens are offensive, by Midwestern standards at least. But this is growing in this really awfully kind of sandy clay business that in the middle of the summer kind of locks up like concrete, and it's just impossible to kind of work in. And it's doing that and doing really, really well. I have no idea how it would hold up necessarily in the summers down here, but Tony's giving it a thumbs down tentatively. But I always the marketing pitch here is that everybody needs a tidal pool in their backyard, a little reflection to kind of go look in. But the little dwarf narcissus and the species kinds. I mean, I'm to the point that I'm like digging up other parts of the garden that were just planted a few years ago to plant more daffodils and to plant more species daffodils. I would have them running over the whole lawn if I could, but it's still my parents' farm. I mean, they live in the house, but I live in the garden, and so it's tedious. I live in an apartment in the city, and so I don't have I have 14 acres at the botanical garden, which I'll get that planted, don't you worry. But there's still my garden at home, which is it's my garden in their house. So, but we have rules about the lawn we have to negotiate. So this is one of the little Cyclaminius types called Rapture. It's been on the market, I think maybe 6-10 years. I don't know. It's a newer variety, and it's really, really, really excellent in drifts. This is kind of an early planting to kind of show it in action there too. The alliums, I mean, we could do a whole talk about alliums. I just adore alliums, and the diversity in them. I mean, there's something like 600-800 species. There's really kind of an allium for every niche and every nook and cranny in some respects. Karataviense, the Turkish or Turkestani onion, is just as cool in foliage as it is in flower. These look like little brooches when they come up in the spring, and they kind of hold these little like thimbles of water out in the garden, and then of course they open up to greater effect too. I could sell more of these than I could irises every spring. People are just smitten with these things, growing kind of amid these sort of shorter irises in the garden. They're a great kind of low-growing companion plant too. Now I have no idea about what Kayla, if anybody has tried, he's giving the thumbs down again too. This is a slide from. This is, I thought, really more or less just on a point of conversation. When we were in the Black Hills several years ago, we came across the easternmost species of Calocortis gunnissonii. These are our western mountain species, Sierra Nevadas and things, but there's this one species that jumps the Rockies and comes all the way to the Great Plains. And at the time, Jim Alt was with me, and Chicago Botanic Gardens' interest in the trip was in doing research for increasing diversity of plants on green roofs. And so, thinking beyond the sedum paradigm and thinking how many things can we actually grow in 3- and 6-inch soil profiles on top of buildings. And so we were accessioning, everything in the sense that just to see for trialing how these things would do in those kinds of low profile situations. In the open garden, I've not necessarily had a lot of luck with these either. In containers or troughs, I've had mild success, but they're not all that lasting and permanent. But kind of one of those interesting things to think about as we think about how we live with the garden as a culture, putting plants on walls, putting plants on roofs, and getting rid of this notion of the outdoor room and really trying to just embrace the garden and the home as one holistic space. It makes you wonder how much diversity we can actually grow on top of the roofs. Little irises, by the way, do fantastic in roof gardens. Chicago Botanic Garden has 2 massive trials of green roof material, and the little irises do really fantastic in those profiles. Whole assortment of species tulips and little grasses that we grow in concert with the little irises as well. The variation in these is really endless. Some of these, I think there's still a lot of interest in what species tulips do well in certain parts of the world. I'm still certainly killing plenty of them, trying to find, I think, the best suite of characteristics and the best species for the niche. This is one that's done fairly well for us, kind of consistently, is Wiedenskii, one of the Russian tulips, as it's sometimes called.
Kelly,
Yes.
on that slide, 2 slides back,
Mhm.
so that in your photo, background, and then one more. Grass.
Yeah, that's a Schizocurium. Yeah, it's a little blue stem too. When you grow up in the prairie and you're surrounded by prairie grasses, you're constantly kind of collecting seed and sort of evaluating things too. Little blue stems. I think a lot of what's on the marketplace is not maybe the best representation of the genetics that are out there too. So I grow a lot of little blue stem and throw away a lot of little blue stem in search of the plants that don't collapse and that stay nice in habits and things. And so there's some forms in the garden there too. As for companions for little irises, they're not necessarily great neighbors. Little blue stem is a bit seedy in its habits sometimes, and so you have to kind of weed out with the scalpel sometimes these little threads of grasses that want to come up between those mats of rhizomes. So it's not always the best choice, but I have it out there, and so I fight it and cuss it, but yet I leave it. So the GMs, the prairie smoke, of course, is one of our prairie natives that does really well in concert with the smaller ones. But there's a whole new interest in breeding GMs coming out of Northern Illinois and Brent Horvath and Intrinsic Perennials. All of them have drink names. So if you're into the cocktail garden parties, you're going to have an excellent assortment of these. They actually make really fun little floaters in drinks too. His marketing pictures, there's varieties like Banana Daiquiri and Cosmopolitan, and he's got them all floating in little glasses and martini glasses and things. So these are still getting their way on the market. I think there's still a lot of breeding potential here. I'd like to see more reblooming in or more remontancy in some of these cultivars. Certainly the combinations of the flowers are nice, and they certainly fit well for the scale of the rock garden and with little irises and the timing of things, but they don't last all that long. It'd be nice to get a little more out of them in that span of time too. I think Sedum tetractinum was one I picked up from Plant Delights many years ago. One of my first orders has proven remarkably hardy for us and is really, really a sedum that people in our part of the world just don't know about. So sedums are obviously very natural combinations for the little irises. They can run through them and run over them and not really cause them a whole lot of grief. Tetractinum is one of my favorites because that winter color is just as the snow is starting to melt and things are kind of coming alive in the garden, that tetractinum is still glowing. Even under the snow for us, I can expect that once that starts to melt, we'll see some really nice color on some of those emerging leaves and things. In a talk I give about 4-season gardening, I tell people that the thing about creating a 4-season garden isn't trying to find plants that do things in 4 seasons. It's trying to find value in what features in some cases might be left from the previous season to appreciate aesthetically and ornamentally. And sometimes winter color on things is maybe as seemingly nonsensical as a sedum is something to really think about and consider. Now there's a whole lot of interest in sedums, and there's a whole lot of new ones coming out. I'm not sure how impressed I am with Dazzleberry necessarily. It's inconsistent at best. I think the jury's out. I would just love to go see these. This is the plants that Chris Hansen, who developed this, have photographed, and I would love to see these because it doesn't quite look like this in my garden necessarily, but it's a Tony, he's the thumbs down back in the room. I'm of that opinion. I have to trial it all so that way I can do the thumbs down piece on it too, and that's so I have it. I'm not necessarily in love with it, but there's a lot of interest in new sedum. So I mean, I think it's pushing us in the right direction. There's a species, sedum tartarinowii. That's a really excellent species for us. Has really excellent dagger-colored foliage. He's giving me thumbs up on that. So there we go. It's about the same size as this sort of stuff too. There's a lot of crosses being done with that. So give some of these newer sedums a shot. They're going to really fit in the scale of things. One of the clones that I'm harboring, that I inherited from somebody, it's not my own, and it's but that we're trying to get out of the marketplace is this sort of dwarf pancake form of Spectabile. It doesn't flop. This is all the bigger that it gets. It's like 6 inches tall. It's like you've taken something that's like silly little Autumn Joy and just shrunk it down into this nice ground-hugging pancake. And maybe that's what we call it, is Iowa pancake. I don't know. But it's an immense plant, and this is sort of after kind of its peak flush. It started to, kind of just get a little heavy with the flowers, but never collapses or falls open and gives that sort of horrible stemmy look that so many of them can. And I have this was the original plant that I started with, and we've got it planted with several other dwarfs in that same scree garden now, and they kind of hold each other accountable. The spikes of the iris fans kind of mesh against these this kind of low-growing form here of this sedum spectabile, so that's kind of nice too. This whole assortment of dwarf or of cacti and the Delospermas and the sempervivums and things is always fun to play with in troughs, especially in the open garden. Even in our humidity, sometimes they can be a little bit testy. But if you give them enough of the drainage around the crowns, the hardy cactus in particular, make fine companions for dwarf irises too. My favorite question when people come to the nursery in the spring is when they go through the gardens in the front, and I always get these very earnest questions of, it must be a lot of work to dig all those cactus out at the end of the year. And because the hardy cactus are just something that people don't think about in the Midwest at all, really. So they really do make fine companions in that sort of case too. Another new plant that the jury might still be out on, this is Fire Spinner, one of these new Delospermas that sort of hit the market about 2 years ago with about 500,000 units into the marketplace. It's actually not really a cultivar, it's really a new species all told. They've given it this sort of marketing name. But I think the jury might be out as to whether it's going to really hold up and really be successful or not. But certainly, you don't get many plants looking like that in the spring garden center market, so I think it certainly caught a lot of people's attention. In the realm of species irises that might be more interesting to folks like us, the iris world sort of looks down on these sorts of things as being kind of underdeveloped and sort of insipid to some degrees. They're these floppy purple things that are a lot of fun. There are 3 shown here that kind of, again, another span of species irises that really haven't been used at all in modern day iris breeding, but that each have kind of some novel traits that I'll tell you about. Albertii has these sort of paintbrush markings, these kind of stains of different colors at the halves on these really, really fine tailored flowers that are a lot of fun. They make really excellent cuts themselves. If you notice, if you would call the florist shop in the spring and ask for irises for your sweetheart, you wouldn't get bearded irises, you'd get Dutch irises, the Ziphium, some of the bulbous irises. It's interesting that the cut flower market is just completely naive about bearded irises. We've had a panel of florists into our garden for several years now, helping us select different lines that we've got that would make great cut flowers for the specialty growers, since there is such a resurgence of interest in slow flowers and locally produced flowers and that sort of thing. There's really a lot of potential, I think, to see some of these finer, more tailored irises in the cut flower market. Iris perryi in the middle is a really close cousin to Iris aphylla, which is an iris that's been used a lot to not only increase bud count, but branching in irises too. This thing about this particular clone of perryi is that it's a repeater, so it'll go through about 3 or 4 distinct flushes of flowers in separate individual stalks over the course of about 6 weeks in the beginning of the spring. It has the potential to be a really novel clone because that rebloom, that remontancy, those genetics are there for it to just keep producing flowers. And they're doing so on new increases. So if you know anything about remontancy, you know that it's a genetic sort of short-circuiting of the process, that it's telling the plant, well, you don't have to go through vernalization to be able to produce flowers again. And so the really novel thing here is that this plant just keeps doing that in a really quick succession of several weeks in the spring on new growth, on new increases. And so this is the first stalk coming off of one increase. This is the second stalk that's coming off of an increase off of that one. And so it's really, it's a bizarre little trait that has some potential for us in terms of breeding, and really nice, stalks. And so it's an early kind of nod to the future, but something that has some potential to certainly be interesting and important. Talk about a little fine, delicate-looking thing. Some of these little dwarf irises from the wild sort of parts of interior Asia are really just not even grown. I mean, they're really truly collector plants, and we don't know a lot about them in modern horticulture. This is Scariosa, one of these just incredibly fine sort of plants. You think a wind might knock that thing over. It's wonderful
Is
to.
that a 6-inch high?
Oh yeah, 6 inches. I mean, it's maybe 8. I mean, it's 6 or 8 inches. It's really compact. A couple of other things that we do a lot with phloxes. The creeping phloxes are about to be completely revolutionized. There are a couple of key breeders that their releases haven't come onto the market yet, but there's going to be a whole new wave of stuff happening in shorter phloxes, which I think is long overdue. I love paniculatas, and they have a place in the garden certainly, but creeping phloxes have a very storied history, particularly with people like Link Foster, in being very essential plants to the rock garden, but have a number of sort of shortfalls and shortcomings that need to be improved upon too. So Coral Eye is one of Link Foster's varieties that sort of persisted, and I anticipate we're going to see a lot of new shorter phloxes in the next couple of years. Here in the middle we have Monarda bradburyana, which is one of the mints I mentioned earlier in the talk. This is probably our single best horse mint on this continent. Really, really good disease resistance, nice and compact, good fall color, which is not something you think of when you think of Monarda. It's really a nice rich flush of purple color. And it's the first of any of the Monardas to bloom. It's very compact, starts flowering for us typically at the end of May. These really pink, soft bubblegum pink flowers with little stipplings and dots. And then just a sort of one other little iris that's kind of in the mix here is a very unusual hybrid called Glow Gleam. And I believe, unfortunately, I'm the only person left growing this variety as far as I know. And so I need to divide the clump. Fortunately, it grows very, very well. It's an interesting cross between bearded irises and then some of the irises that I showed you earlier, the Manchurica flavissima humilis complex. Those sort of, I said that kind of span over the whole course of the Asian continent. You get these really amazing neon yellow flowers crossed with the traditional colors of bearded irises, and you get this little combination in between. It's sterile, so it's not proof kind of a dead end for breeding and development. Has tons of flowers that this really pretty bright garnet color. And I think and it's like 60 years old. I mean, this is a cultivar that's been around for a very long time, but just has really kind of fallen out of the mix and things too. But it's really a fantastic garden plant. In the category of things that nod, I have a series of botanical humor shirts that I want to do, and one of them is Noddy, N-O-D-D-Y, a little true plant geek shirt. But, so a whole assortment of interesting things that nod. I'm a huge fan of the Orna clematis. I love non-vining clematis. Clematis albicoma is a really, really great plant that native to parts here of the southeast and then to farther west. It does amazingly well in Denver. It does fantastic in Iowa. I've just really been impressed with that. And their nature, their habits of not wanting to be really rambly viners, but really nice, tidy, kind of herbaceous things, works really, really well with shorter irises, as do things like, of course, the very familiar Aquilegia corbett, the pure yellow form, and even fritillaries, the whole host of fritillaries and bulbs. We could talk all day about fritillaries. I think there's just so many out there that are worth considering. I did throw a couple of Cicericiums in. I did throw a few in. I even made a nod to heucheras. Everybody gets all galvanized against heucheras today because there's just so many of them out there. But we have to remember that even before the era of Dan Himes, there was people breeding heucheras, and one of them was, I lost his name. He was a Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden for many years and developed this canyon series of heucheras that love to grow in the absolute crevice of a rock. The canyon series blooms fantastically. It's really, really wonderful. They're very hard to find. They're not produced much in the marketplace, but still have a lot of potential and a lot of great uses with dwarf irises and things. Cicericiums, just tons of these. There are so many species up and down this hemisphere. in colors ranging from yellows and oranges to these blues, even whites. Angustifolium is one of the more common species. Palmifolium was one of the more interesting ones that I showed you in the beginning. Not hardy in our part of the world, but certainly one worth admiring. These have the same kind of grassy sort of foliage, that equitant leaves that you would expect from other irises too, but just kind of add a whole nother level of things. I love putting the two together and showing the contrast in their foliage and their scale. The calamints too, I love mints. I just love Lamiaceae, as screwed up as it is taxonomically. I love the variations, the calamints and clinopodiums and all those genera they're kind of just underappreciated. They kind of lurk in the background in so many respects. And some of which the forms of grandiflora are really low and compact and have a really nice home in the rock garden, certainly. Clicker is really slow. Silver foliage of the really fine leaf forms of Enothera, or Enothera macrocarpa, which is distributed kind of all over, but there's several distinct forms of it too. It does really, really well for us through the summer. And I'm always looking at little grasses. I'm always looking I'm a grass geek. I grew up on the prairie, and not everything has to be big and tall in the grass world. There's a lot of room for big blue stems and little blue stems, but there's things that are even shorter than that. The Cheilerias, these are the June grasses. This is widely distributed all over the continent, and it really is just a matter of finding provenance that works best. The most aesthetically pleasing provenances I found are in the western Great Plains that are kind of just shortened versions of Carl Forster. And I'm always looking for an alternative for Calamagrostis for people who say that Calamagrostis Carl Forster is about the only grass that they grow. It's like trying to teach a child to have a broader appetite. It's just kind of pulling back the visors a little bit, seeing what else is out there in the range of things. There's blue forms, species that have bluish green foliage like that too. Bodilua gracillus blonde ambition. These Bodiluas are a mid-continental genus. There's several species of them. This is a newer variety from David Salmon that I've seen doing pretty well in several parts of the country. And again, a little taller maybe for some of the dwarf irises, but a great background plant too, to certainly showcase that early texture and foliage that you see against those irises when they are in bloom. I know this is bad to say in a rock garden group, but I'm a bit of a Dianthus hater. They melt. They become little brown shag rugs in the middle of the summer, and they after the pink bubble gums are gone, you're left with this yuckiness. I'm a huge proponent of Silenes, and I wish we saw more Silenes. I wish I had time to tend to the Silene crosses that are kind of growing in the wild out in one of my trial areas at the farm. I love Silenes. Longwood is a Jim Alt cultivar from back in the day. Rockin' Robin is a really fantastic plant that is kind of really tough to find anymore. But they form really great low mats. They have lots and lots of flowers. They're really tough in sort of hot and humid kinds of conditions. Work really well for kind of tying together clumps of irises when there's nothing going on in the iris world. You're left with what architecture and remnants of the foliage you can have, but tied together with these really nice swarms of bubblegum pinks. One Dianthus that has held up pretty well for us from some friends of mine, plantsmen in northeast Iowa. This is a Dianthus freinii that was taken on a 105-degree day in the middle of July a couple of summers ago at their farm. And I mean, the flowers are just kind of starting to go, it's a little hot. I mean, they're kind of starting to sort of, tuck back a little bit, but really is about one of the only Dianthus that I have any respect for, even in our part of the world. So a brief little sort of side bent on Gaillardias. I took this photo actually here at J.C. Ralston 5 years ago when I was here in the fall. It was the first time I had seen it, and I was really impressed by it. I had always kind of been a Gaillardia hater. It was one of the plants that my mom and I just were completely at odds about. For whatever reason, she loved Gaillardia, and she loved the fact that they reseeded everywhere, and that every single one that came up looked really great for the first 2 weeks it was in flower until it started to fall apart and dishevel into a brown, fuzzy mess. I just couldn't get it. I just didn't think anything of it. So I took this photo. I was impressed by it walking around, and I kind of shoveled it away until a couple years ago in the Black Hills, I had this epiphany about Gaillardias and their variation. One of the things that's interesting sometimes about horticulture is we get creative about our crosses, but we kind of forget to sort of share the fact that Gaillardia grandiflora, for example, is a cross between a perennial species and an annual species. So what do you think might happen when you make a cross between a perennial plant and an annual plant? What might you guess about the children that would come out of that cross? some of them are going to want to be annuals, and some of them are not going to know what they want to be, and they're just going to give up. So it's an interesting situation in horticulture, and yet there are so many varieties of Gaillardia grandiflora on the market, and they're so inconsistent across the whole country in terms of how they perform in the garden. So there are obviously true perennial species of Gaillardia. Gaillardia aristata is one of those. And I was just amazed. We got above 7,000 feet in the Black Hills, and it was just incredible the kind of variation that was out there. I mean, the flower forms were all over the map. We actually even found forms that were true ground covers, that had runners and formed colonial kinds of mats. We had some that had these kind of gumdrop-sized disc flowers. We had these laciniate rays. We had the semi-doubles and big, wide, fat petals. They were all over the place. We even found quilled forms, which promptly died after I brought it home. That was a trip. That was a summer where we came home from the Black Hills and it was like 100 degrees for like 10 days, and so the division we brought back sort of thought it liked Iowa for a little bit and then quickly disappeared. We have the GPS locations and I will be back. So we didn't dig at all. So if any luck, we might still find it. But there's a lot of actually interest. It's kind of, like I said, a total detour, but one of these plants that I've tolerated in my garden for many years, but might actually have some interest now, especially when you consider that there is breeding work now happening with the purple forms and trying to increase the color range in Gaillardias. It would be interesting to see what actually comes out of that. Other little just kinds of shoestring sorts of things that come around in the garden. Pacorus, this little weedy kind of Senecio relative that I've tolerated in my garden for many years, and I've kind of grown to have a fondness for it. I've decided that if every garden has to have weeds, you might as well get to choose them and plant them and tolerate them as you will. So, and certainly bookended by a plant that certainly is not a weed. I wish it was weedier. Was the shooting stars and the dodecathians. There's several species of these. The eastern species, Media, gave rise to some hybrids like amethyst that have done really well for us. So kind of wrapping things up here, kind of going over the rainbow and sort of rounding it back up with some of the iris work that we're doing. That's a portion of our farm. About a third of it. The production field's about 7.5 acres. This was still taken when we had cattle, and there's actually a lake down here now, so it's a lot more picturesque, but there's no cows roaming the hillside, so that's changed. It's a little bit different, but this is mostly tall-bearded irises out here. The shorter stuff is a lot closer to the house, but just a nod to some of the things and some of the ideas that we're pursuing in hopes of finding better and better little irises. This is a Pumila-derived seedling. You can really see again that very classic kind of small tailored flower with that intensification of color in a little clump. It's just tidy and cute. So nothing exciting as far as color goes, but tremendous vigor and tremendous flowering potential. And we're hoping that leads us down a path of something interesting. Yeah, that's what I thought too when I first saw that. Yes, this is an interesting product of amateur delight. There's a woman who lives in Pennsylvania who got some seeds from the Species Iris group one year, grew them out, and all of a sudden ended up with this really interesting kind of turquoise variant in her seed lot that she named Keystone Oracle. It is a most vigorous Pumila selection. Bob, are you growing this one?
No.
Did she not? Okay, she only shared it with a couple of people, and I don't know who she all shared it with, but Sherry Jessberger is her name. Just a backyard gardener interested in irises. Thought she'd try growing some from seed, and turns out to have a winner here right out of the gate. So it's incredibly vigorous. Flowers its head off. This was the first flower. The first year I had it, I was gone kind of later when the better clump shots were in place. But Keystone Oracle is just, it's incredible. Notice something really interesting and maybe not as desirable from a breeding standpoint is that, like pure Pumila, the falls reflex really, really severely under they tuck. So the flowers have an interesting kind of shape because of it, but it's kind of cute when you see a little tribe of them with their little, kind of tucking petals like that. It's interesting. From a breeding standpoint, we want to kind of peel those out so we can see more of the petals. Friend of ours, Gary Slagle in New Jersey, who's a new breeder to the scene, is doing some exciting work with the metallic tones and the metallic patterns in irises, really trying to, this is a standard dwarf, so it's only about 12, 14 inches tall, really getting wider, bigger, fatter flowers to show more color and more pattern on. So we're really excited to see where some of his work goes in that direction. That did not happen in 2013. We did not introduce this yet. This was one of those varieties that performed so well for us, but we had sent it out for trial And apparently it's an Iowa select kind of thing, because in California it grew twice the size that we thought it was going to be, and quickly grew into kind of a monster. So we actually pulled it. We're not going to introduce it. It's gorgeous in my own garden, even if I am the only one who grows it and gets to enjoy it. It's really nice, but it really was inconsistent when we sent it west and south. So it's still registered, but it won't probably ever be introduced, but hopefully has some potential for breeding for us. Thinking about browns and chocolates and reds, another one of Gary's seedlings, to that red color is just so saturated. It's just like a drop of blood on a canvas of flowers. And that's really the kind of clump effect that we're going for in these seedlings. That's a 2-year clump. I mean, and I don't know, I didn't have a graduate student to count the flowers for me, but I did that once, and so I wasn't doing it again. But I don't know, there's dozens of them there for sure. And so that kind of vigor and that kind of floral effect is really what we want, because you can even see these aren't even all the first flowers. There's a lot of these that are really done. So a clump like that's going to last for weeks on end. That's really the effect that we're kind of looking for in some of our breeding work. Our friend Carol Coleman at West came up with Buzz with Charm, which we trialed in several different places. And it consistently forms a carpet of flowers. By Iris standards, the flower looks a little bit dated, but the hell with AIS and the rules sometimes. I have the name F the Rules registered, so that someday when I find an iris that just completely breaks the mold, I've got a name for it. So I don't expect to win any accolades for that, but I'll get a kick out of it. So Buzz with Charm, it certainly is a very charming plant in mass. Again, it's a carpet of flowers. It's a really vigorous variety. This is another 2-year clump that you're just looking at really a piece of the pie of. It's full of color. I could have sold it for 3 years before we even introduced it. It's right at the lead of the gate coming into the trial yards and things. And a little nod to some work that's happening kind of under the radar but in the background. Everybody knows blackberry lily, and everybody knows Iris dichotoma, and these have been around for a long time, and they're passed around and whatever. But the crosses that were made between them in the 1970s by a man named Sam Norris, who as far as I know is no relation to me. Well, it's spelled the same, and he was from a part of the country where I had descendants from, but as far as I know, we're not related. Came up with these really great things called candy lilies. And, Park Seed had these for many years. Harlan Hammernick at Bluebird Nursery did a lot of work with them. And Daryl Probst has been doing some crosses and doing some introductions with these. This is like the first group of plants that we're going to have to market based on the time of day when you're home. Marty Schaefer and Jan Sachs just released a new one. I just saw the catalog 2 nights ago for the first time. And they actually have in the description of the plant, blooms from 11:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. So it's like, so because if you work during the day, this is because the variation in the flowering times between the two parents is pretty huge. Blackberry lilies are daytime flowers, and Vesper irises are mostly evening, late afternoon, evening, if not nighttime flowers in some cases. So you get this incredible array of flowers, some which open at coffee time at 8 o'clock in the morning, and some of which are still open at wine hour, 8 o'clock at night. Making crosses between your favorite seedlings gets really interesting because you have to think about, and because the flowers only last for 1 day, so you have to collect pollen in the morning for things you want to make crosses for at night. And the variation is just huge in between them. So we've been making crosses with Daryl's varieties, which tend to have more of an iris form to the flowers, evoking Iris dichotoma, the Vesper iris, than those of Harlan's, which have more of a Bellum canda form, which are more kind of open-faced and kind of more outward like that, less with kind of the notchings of the falls like that. So there's some interesting patterns. These are a few of our seedlings that we're working with, kind of drawing out some of Harlan's genetics. These are actually several years old. We've got a lot more interesting stuff now. We've actually started importing germplasm from China of Iris domestica because it turns out there's actually a lot of variation in it. Some of those are 4 and 5 feet tall with incredible branching. The bud counts on a lot of Daryl's varieties, things like Summer Candy, 300, 350, 400 buds sometimes on these plants. My only complaint against some of those is that I have like the same size clump that I've always ever had. Like I have 3 fans, and that's all the more that it does. They put out an incredible flowering display, but they don't really clump up necessarily. But they're also trying to support 350 flowers on every single stalk, so give a guy a break. But the stuff on the Dazzler series and the Sangrias and the Sunset Tones, the things that our lines kind of started with coming out of Harlan Hammernick's work, have anywhere from 125 to 200 buds per stalk. So a little less, but they also are a little more vigorous and they get more of a true clump effect than maybe what some of these do. So it's an interesting sort of novelty kind of exploration, and we'll see kind of where it goes. but also working with dwarf forms of Iris siberica and Iris typhifolia, which are two Siberian iris species. The thing about Siberian iris is that for so long, if I said Siberian iris, what would you say? Caesar's brother, right? It's like a reflex, and maybe butter and sugar. But the color variation in Siberian irises has completely been blown off the roof. I mean, Marty Schaefer and Jan Sachs have some amazing color breaks. Rubies, pomegranates, caramels, turquoises. I mean, they've really just changed the whole thing. Joe Pye Weed Gardens, jpwflowers.com, if you want to just go on a pure sort of plant porn fest when you get home. I mean, you're just going to see these incredible galleries of just seedlings and photos of varieties they've released. It's really incredible. But there's more variation out there to work with. We actually have seeds of a version of Sanguinea growing at the Botanical Garden right now, a form that's shared around as a variety Tobatensis that is only supposed to flower at 10 inches tall. The seedling variation in the lot suggests that we're going to get some a lot taller than that, and maybe even some that are a little bit shorter than that. So there's the idea that we can get some of these really nice clear, watery blue colors, and even maybe some of their crazy colors onto really compact, short plants that might be able to hold up in a lot better conditions than maybe what we've associated with Iris sanguinea and Siberica derived varieties. This is just a seedling lot showing kind of the span of bloom time. Typhifolia has always been associated with earliness in the Siberian bloom spectrum. It blooms about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of the rest of them. But in fact, when you start growing out seed-grown varieties, you get bloom seasons that go over the course of 4 to 6 weeks. This was taken on June 1st. This particular provenance, long done. These two just kind of past peak, and that one's just kind of starting. So we've got a lot of variation to work with there too. I didn't lug along copies of the books in this particular trip, but you can check out the book if you haven't seen it yet on our nursery website, which is rainbowfarms.net. We still are selling copies there. And I wanted to give a little nod to kind of the next chapter, the current chapter of my life that I find myself in, building a new botanical garden. So I quickly threw this in after Helen mentioned something about it. I thought, oh gosh, I need to put this in here. A nod to my employer, But we're an old facility, but we're a new institution. So our conservatory is a geodesic dome that was built in 1979. And it's about 18,000 square feet. We have about 12,000 square foot of supporting greenhouse ranges for that facility. There's never really been anything outside of any significant effect. There was a rose garden in the front yard. There's a collection of Buck roses. Dr. Buck was an ISU professor who released about 100 different varieties of shrub roses that are known for doing really well in the Midwest. But there wasn't a lot else on the property. In fact, it was a facility that people had gotten very tired with. And sort of it had a bad reputation that once you'd sort of been there, you'd kind of seen it because nothing ever changed. And for the last 9 years, it's a city-owned property. The city actually built it with private dollars, some help from private dollars in 1979. The city nearly bankrupted it as a facility at the end of the 20th century. And early 2000s, our local water utility stepped up and said, well, they would run it on a year-to-year basis until the city figured out what it was going to do. So for 9 years, our local water utility actually ran a public garden. And without them, it probably wouldn't even be there anymore. It probably would be a hotel or something. This is a very prime piece of real estate in downtown Des Moines, right along the river. Iowa's busiest interstate, 235, is right here. University Avenue leading into the Drake neighborhood, and where Drake University's at is right here. Housing development is right here. Like it's a very well-defined 14-acre property. There's no 60-acre expansion. There's no area for a parking deck. Like, this is what we have. And so our founders about 4 years ago got together, or 5 years ago now, got together and said, look, this just can't do. We have to fix this. And so they, 4 local philanthropists, started rallying people's support. And in the course of about a year after they kicked off their fundraising campaign, had raised $10 million to basically rejuvenate not only the building itself, not really the conservatory, but more or less kind of the administrative spaces, the meeting rooms, and that sort of thing, but begin building all these outdoor gardens on the 14-acre property. That eventually expanded in a year and a half to over $12 million. We're launching into our second phase of fundraising right now with a $6.2 million goal that we hope to have raised by the end of the year to sort of keep building out kind of in each phase that we have planned. So by the end of the fall, in October, when we celebrate our grand opening, we will be up to here. And I promise there's an Iris connection here. And so, horticulturists and landscape architects come from very different parts of the world. And I have great respect for the landscape architecture profession. I have friends who are landscape architects, and that's great, but we come from very different realms of the universe. And so putting a team of landscape architects into the room with a mouthy, somewhat opinionated horticulturist like myself can lead to very interesting discussions about plants and how we think about gardens as they're coming together. And so the planting process, when I basically started 15 months ago, my boss told me, in 2 weeks, you need to have a sense of what we're going to, there was no planting plan. It was like this master plan, and it was sort of like, yeah, in 2 weeks, I'd like to see you talk about the plant list for the garden. And so, incredibly exhilarating experience, but also one where, you have all these sort of lines drawn, but there's not a sense of what's going to be planted between them. So it's been a dream. I mean, it's been a lot of fun. But some of those meetings got a little contentious as to sort of about where plants would go, the sizes of plants that we would plant. And after one of those meetings, we were in Chicago. Our landscape architecture firm is in Chicago, and so we'd been for one kind of charrette. We'd gone back about 3 weeks later for a second one, and we walk into the room, and they had all these nice rolls and sweets out. They had coffee and tea. They just rolled out the rug for us, and they sat down. We started talking about different portions of the landscape, and we got to the allée. It's a very formal, kind of business, and it's 220 feet long. It's a State Street maple alley, which was one of my, it was the only battle I lost, probably, and I dealt with it, I got over it. I'm not excited by State Street maples, but whatever. So I made that very clear, that I thought we were playing it incredibly safe in making that choice and not being very adventurous. And so they came back and they said, all right, well, we know that you don't love the State Street maples, so have you thought about what you want to do under the alley? And I had, and I didn't really play my cards. I just kind of said, yeah, well, what are you thinking? And they said, well, we hear you're into irises. And so the slide that flicks up on the screen at that point is a shot of, as a historic slide actually, of property in the East Coast somewhere, taken maybe 1915 or something, this long, continuous border of irises. And they thought, how would you feel about doing a classic iris alley along your alley? And I mean, so these trees, this is an ephemeral part of the landscape. I mean, once these trees grow in, obviously bearded irises planted down the double file stretches on the 220-foot length aren't going to do well, but for the first 7 years, it's going to be pretty fantastic. We're planting 3,600 irises in these sort of, waved beds. And they were sort of like, I wonder where we would get some of those at. So, guess who's donating all the irises to that part of the project? But anyway, it's going to be pretty exciting. We're hosting the 2017 American Iris Society National Convention in Des Moines, and so this is 2014, 2017. I would say by year 3, 4, once they'll be in the third year of their life. At that point, they'll be pretty much at that really peak of their existence before they kind of start to get a little crowded, and we'll take them out and do something else eventually. But so we've got them staged so that the flowers are happening. No room for dwarfs. This is an alley. The profile is a little taller than that. So we'll have irises in bloom from the 1st of May through about the middle of June. And then we're planting 1,500 Candida lilies and Bellum candas, so we can come back and see this sorts of parade of summer irises into August. So we have a lot of fun, and we're hoping the garden really shows that kind of passion and that spirit for plantsmanship and great horticulture. So come up and see us if you haven't been to Iowa. Des Moines is a great city, has a lot to offer, and with any luck, we're going to have a pretty cool botanical garden in a few years. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Great.
Kelly, and then we're going to have a big auction, no break, because we get a lot of plants. And Tony's been kind enough to be our auctioneer. So,
What questions do you have? Yes, ma'am.
I heard bearded irises only bloom on 1 year, and then the next 2 months we dig it up, throw it away. Is that true?
Well, so every rhizome, with the exception of it's a rebloom or not, but let's just not talk about those for a minute. So a rhizome essentially has one flower bud in it, in which it's going to produce, it's going to flower, but that rhizome is going to set increase in the same growing season in which it flowers. So you really want to throw that rhizome away, because that's really what's kind of facilitating the growth of that clump, that sort of network of plants. I mean, they are truly perennial because they do maintain this sort of network of plants, and essentially this network of buds that comes to exist. But it is true that a rhizome has one flower bud in it. Again, separate if obviously if it's a rebloom or it's developing a second flower bud in the same season without the need to be vernalized again. But you don't want to throw it away. You want to certainly make sure that you keep it, and it certainly facilitates the growth of that clump.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I noticed that on a lot of the photos, when you showed them the ground they're growing in, it didn't look like the rhizomes were exposed like you do with tall bearded iris.
Yeah.
will they tolerate more cover?
I think part of that might be, to some degree, the locations of where the photos were taken. So, I mean, yes, to your point, it's essential for bearded irises to be pretty much at or near the soil surface and preferably exposed if possible. But, however, there are parts of the world where soils are really light, and you might have to plant your irises at some depth, just so that over the course of time that they establish and that they settle in, you can assume that a certain amount of that soil is going to sort of settle out. In places like Texas, where there's soils kind of all over the map, depending on where you're at, but it can get so blisteringly hot, and this might apply even in your part of the world too, is that it's okay to sort of set those rhizomes a little below the soil surface, because you can actually scald the top of the rhizomes, and you can actually kind of fry out new growth, and in some cases, if it's really, really hot, like my grandparents live in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, and so my grandma grows irises actually remarkably successfully. I was surprised, but if they do get a blistering hot summer in which she's not put a nice top dressing of gravel or something over it, she'll never get flowers, because they just kind of just sit there, and because they're never really developing those flower buds properly. So it kind of depends on the part of the world that you're in. Our soil, at least in a lot of those photos were from my own garden. A lot of those, not all of them, but I know in my own garden at home, I've really worked to create a very friable kind of soil at the surface, so I don't mind planting them a little below it, because I know that they're still going to get the drainage that they need. So that's an astute observation.
Okay, one more question.
Yes?
Do you still need to divide them every, 3 years or so?
It kind of depends on the variety. There are varieties that could be divided every year because they're that rampant. There are varieties that you just sort of wait long enough to get them to a perfect clump that you feel guilty if you have to divide them, because you just kind of want to leave them to kind of do their thing. So it really just depends. Some of those varieties, some of the like Glow Gleam, some of those that are interspecific hybrids and things, I've never divided my Glow Gleam in probably 6 years, and it doesn't care. It just keeps flowering, it just keeps going. So it just really kind of depends some cases per variety. I mean, generally speaking, we would say every 2 to 4 years for the class, but it just kind of depends. So I'll be around and happy to answer other things too. So thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.